Before Nigeria became the powerhouse of West Africa, it was a patchwork of diverse kingdoms, empires, and communities, each with its own way of life. Then came the British, and like guests who overstayed their welcome, they did not just move in, they rearranged the furniture. When the British formally claimed Nigeria as a colony in the early 20th century, they did not quite understand what they had signed up for. It wasn't a single unified land waiting to be governed. It was a patchwork of over 250 ethnic groups, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, and operating with drastically different political systems. From the centralized Islamic caliphate in the north to the complex but more egalitarian societies in the south, this was not going to be easy. In this edition of Back in History, we take you down memory lane to the story of how the British colonial government employed different codes of governance in the administration of northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria at the same time. We look at the implication of this decision at the time of its implementation. We look at the reasons advanced by the colonial government in the implementation of direct rule in one part and indirect rule in another part of the same country. We ask the question about the effectiveness or otherwise of these two systems of administration that applied to Nigeria. Before 1914, there was no Nigeria as we know it today. The British had divided the area into protectorates of northern Nigeria and the protectorate of southern Nigeria and the colony of Lagos. Each territory had different styles of administration and distinct challenges. The north was vast, dry, and predominantly Muslim, ruled by emirs under the Sokoto Caliphate. The south was more fragmented, with powerful traditional rulers, bustling port cities, and growing Western educated elites. But running these regions was expensive. British officials were few, funding was limited, and governance from London was far removed from the underground complexities and realities of the moment. Lord Frederick Lugard, the colonial administrator appointed to oversee the territory, faced a fundamental challenge. How do you govern millions of people with minimal British manpower and limited funds? This challenge was what made Britain to introduce two primary methods of governance: direct rule and indirect rule. Lord Lugard's strategy wasn't new. It was practical colonial math. Where local systems were strong and hierarchical, like the emirs in the north, the British could rule indirectly, keeping existing power structures intact while pulling the strings from behind. Where local authority was less centralized or perceived as disorganized, as in much of the south, the British chose to administer directly, placing colonial officers in charge and building bureaucratic structures from scratch. In other words, in such areas, British officials were directly involved in the administration of the day-to-day running of the areas. The goal wasn't to unite or develop the people. It was to maintain order and extract resources. Palm oil, tin ore, cocoa, and groundnuts were the prices. Governance was merely a means to protect British economic interests and secure the territory from rival European powers. In the southern regions of Nigeria, the British faced a very different political landscape than in the north. Here in the south, centralized authority wasn't the norm, especially among the Igbos and other groups in the eastern region. Power was decentralized, often spread across village councils, elders, age grades, and title societies. The Yorubas, by contrast, had kings and chiefs, but even their power was balanced by a network of advisors and community checks. This posed a major problem for the British, whose colonial policy depended on using existing structures to administer and rule. In the absence of a clear hierarchy, they chose to create their own version of it. Thus emerged direct rule, a more hands-on system of governance that involved British officials stepping directly into the role of administration. British district officers, residents, and other colonial officials were stationed throughout the South to collect taxes, maintain law and order, enforce colonial policies, and most importantly, ensure a smooth flow of resources to the crown. Even under direct rule, the British still did not have enough personnel. To plug this gap, they invented a workaround, namely the use of warrant chiefs. These were handpicked local men given colonial authority with a British-issued warrant. They weren't always traditional rulers and often had little or no legitimacy in the eyes of the people. But to the British, they were useful middlemen who could collect taxes, preside over native courts, and enforce colonial regulations. In areas like Igbo land, where governance had historically been democratic and community-based, this imposition of warrant chiefs created chaos. Imagine living in a community where decisions had always been made by consensus, and all of a sudden, a man with no traditional backing is put in charge, ruling with the backing of a foreign power and demanding taxes you never paid before. This fueled resentment. In fact, it sparked the Aba Women's Riot of 1929, one of the most notable acts of resistance against British rule. Thousands of women in the eastern provinces mobilized in protest against taxation and abuse of power by warrant chiefs. They stormed colonial offices, disrupted court sessions, and loudly rejected this imposed authority. Meanwhile, in the Yoruba West, where kings like the Alaafin of Oyo or the Oba of Lagos had traditional authority, the British tried to walk through them but still found ways to centralize control. Courts were restructured, taxes were introduced, and colonial schools were established to train a new elite force that would help propagate British values and keep the administrative machinery running. So while the South was technically under direct rule, it was a hybrid model. British officers ran the show, but relied heavily on compromised local agents who often wielded power without traditional checks and authority. This system alienated many communities and disrupted indigenous governance and planted seeds of distrust towards both colonial officers and the local collaborators they empowered. If the South was a colonial puzzle, the North was, in the eyes of the British, a colonial administrator's dream. This region already had an established political structure, the Sokoto Caliphate. Formed in the early 1800s through the jihad of Osman Dan Fodio, it was a centralized Islamic empire with emirs governing vast emirates under the spiritual and political authority of the Sultan of Sokoto. When the British conquered the North between 1902 and 1903, an idea struck them. Rather than dismantle the system, they would co-opt it. This became the blueprint for indirect rule, the hallmark of British colonial governance in northern Nigeria. Rather than send armies of British administrators, they returned the existing rulers, the emirs, and ruled through them. The emirs remained in charge of tax collection, local law and order, and customary courts. They answered to British residents and district officers, but were allowed a considerable degree of autonomy. To the people, it often seemed as if little had changed. The emirs were still in power, wearing their turbans, sitting in palaces, commanding loyalty, but the reality was different. The emirs were now accountable to the British, not the caliphate or their people. Any disobedience could result in removal, and in some cases it did. The British codified their power in ordinances, established provincial administrations, and placed British officials behind the scenes calling the shots. The emirs became essentially colonial subcontractors. Indirect rule worked more smoothly in the north than in the south, and here is why. 1. Centralization. The Sokoto Caliphate already had a hierarchical command structure, so the British did not need to create a new system. 2. Islamic law, the Sharia. The north had a functioning legal framework. The British allowed Islamic law to continue in civil matters, though they set limits when it conflicted with British interest. 3. Limited Western influence. The British restricted Christian missionary activities and Western education in the north to prevent cultural disruption. This approach contrasted with the south, where churches and schools were flourishing. By maintaining the conservative status quo, the British minimized resistance in the north. But there was a downside. The insulation of the north under indirect rule created a significant developmental gap between the regions. Southern Nigerians had earlier access to Western education, becoming lawyers, clerks, and civil servants, and began agitating for independence much earlier. The North, meanwhile, remained largely feudal and underdeveloped, with political power concentrated in the hands of a few emirs and malams. Indirect rule preserved the power of the traditional elites, but at the cost of broader societal progress. It also reinforced ethnic and religious divisions that would later become more pronounced in Nigeria's post-independence politics. Moreover, because the emirs owed their positions to the British rather than to the people, the connection between the ruler and the ruled weakened. Governance became less about serving the people and more about maintaining order and extracting revenue for the crown and the emir. The British were pleased with minimal personnel and maximum cooperation they had termed a vast and complex region, namely northern Nigeria. By the early 20th century, Nigeria was a single colony on the map, but in practice, it was two different worlds stitched together by force by British ambition. The direct rule system in the south and indirect rule system in the north created a divided administrative identity. The result was a country managed under two incompatible operating systems. This difference had profound long-term consequences. In the south, the embrace of Western education bred a generation of nationalists, writers, lawyers, and activists who would later lead the charge for independence. The North, on the other hand, lagged behind educationally and politically, remaining largely conservative and religiously inclined. These differences did not just stop at governance and education. They affected social mobility, access to opportunity, and political representation. By the time Nigeria gained independence in 1960, these discrepancies had become entrenched, leading to regional suspicion, competition, and disunity, all of which continue to echo till today. From a colonial management perspective, the British approach was pragmatic. They believed in using the easiest routes to control each area. But this convenience came at a heavy cost. The South grew restless and revolutionary. The North grew isolated and traditionalist. And the Middle Belt regions were caught somewhere in between, sometimes pulled towards Southern activism, other times looped into Northern conservatism. So when we talk about Nigeria's post-independence struggles, the civil war, the coups, the ethnic and religious divides, it is impossible to ignore how much of it was seeded by this two-track colonial system. When the British finally packed their bags and handed over the reins of power in 1960, they did not just leave Nigeria with flags, borders, and an anthem. They left behind two very different governing systems that had been stitched together without alignment. And that split, though invisible to the naked eyes, has shaped the trajectory of Nigeria's leadership, corruption patterns, bureaucracy, and even its federal structure till today. Let's start with leadership. Indirect rule had long trained northern emirs to govern their regions with a centralized hierarchical approach. Leadership was about obedience and control passed down by tradition. This continued post-independence. Northern leaders were largely conservative, religious, and preferred elite consensus over populist mobilization. In contrast, the southern regions had tested the British version of direct rule with its bureaucracy-heavy, paper-pushing model. Southerners were exposed to Western education, Christianity, and civil service training earlier. It is no coincidence that most of the first nationalists, civil servants, and technocrats who led the fight for independence came from the South. Now, let's talk about corruption and bureaucracy. The direct rule model introduced a rigid, formal bureaucracy, one that prized form, signatures, and documentation. But it was also impersonal and disconnected from the people. Post-independence, this grew into a bloated civil service structure riddled with red tape and inefficiency. Nigerians today still joke about having to file the same document 3 times to get a passport. That's the ghost of colonial bureaucracy at work. Indirect rule, on the other hand, embedded patronage systems. Under the emirs, loyalty was everything. Favors were exchanged for support, and power centralized in the hands of a few. This tradition continued after independence, mutating into a system where government contracts, jobs, and services were tied to who you knew, a system ripe always for corruption. And what about federal structure? Nigeria was amalgamated as one country in 1914, but it has never functioned like one country. The North, with its centralized system under the emirs, resisted integration. The South, with its more fragmented and competitive system, pushed for autonomy. This tug of war continues to haunt Nigeria's federal system till today. Power struggles between federal and state governments, uneven development, and regional tensions all stem from this lopsided colonial inheritance. In essence, the British did not just rule Nigeria, they programmed it. They installed 2 different software systems in the same machine, and today that machine is still glitching. So, was the legacy of British rule a broken system or a lasting foundation? It depends on who you ask. For some, colonial rule laid the groundwork for administration, education, and infrastructure. But for many others, it left behind a fractured political culture, deep ethnic divisions, and an elite-focused system where power flows upward, not downward. And if you trace the lines of today's Nigeria, from the tensions in the north to the bureaucratic walls in the south, you will find they were drawn not just in 1914, but in the very way the British chose to govern the country. So what did the British really leave behind? More than railway tracks and court buildings. The system of rule they imposed, divided between indirect traditions and direct administration, became Nigeria's starting software. But instead of syncing seamlessly, the systems clashed, duplicated, and malfunctioned. From bureaucracy to political structure, from leadership styles to corruption patterns, the roots often trace back to those colonial decisions. Indirect rule handed power to traditional elites who became political gatekeepers. Direct rule spawned a bureaucratic jungle where progress often gets lost. Today, when Nigeria stumbles through uneven developments, conflicting regional interests, or power imbalances, it is not just history. It is the living legacy of how this country was once governed. If Nigeria wants to move forward, maybe it is time to look back and understand how the foundation was laid. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to the channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. I am your friend and host, Ekemini Udim, wishing you the best in all you do.